What's new in WCAG 2.2 with Allison Ravenhall, AliCamp 2022. AliCamp would like to thank our gold sponsors Intopia, Salesforce and Telstra, and silver sponsors ANZ, Deloitte Digital and Coles.
Good morning, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Allison Ravenhall and I'm coming to you from Melbourne, Australia, on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Thanks for joining me as I talk about what's new in WCAG 2.2 Candidate Recommendation. As I speak to you in mid-October, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines version 2.2 has progressed to Candidate Recommendation, which is one of the final steps before finalization and publication, which is expected at the end of the year. That means that this entire talk has a huge disclaimer on it and lots of asterisks. Everything I'm about to talk about is subject to change. So if you find yourself referring to this in the future, please make sure that you check the documentation to make sure that whatever I've mentioned here is still in play. If you want to get in touch with me, I'm usually hanging on Twitter. You'll find me there. My handle is Ravenally, Ravenally. So today I'm going to talk about the 9 new success criteria, which is in the WCAG 2.2 candidate recommendation. Now, you can slice and dice these success criteria a few different ways, depending on what you prefer. So if your thing is levels, we're going to be looking at 2 level A, 5 double A, and 2 triple A success criteria. If your thing is principles, we've got 5 operable and 4 understandable success criteria coming at you. And if your thing is guidelines, then the new success criteria are categorized by 3 in navigable, 2 in input modalities, 1 in predictable, and 3 in input assistance. Whatever you choose is up to you. Either way, let's jump in. I haven't presented these in any particular order other than quickest first. There's some absolute doozies amongst this lot, so I thought we'll warm up with some pretty straightforward ones first. So to kick it off, I'd like to introduce you to a level A success criterion called redundant entry. And this is all about data capture in forms. And the whole idea of redundant entry can be summarized in this one statement. Shipping address is the same as billing address. This is the most common example that I can think of the redundant entry premise, which is basically that wherever we're capturing the same information multiple times within a form or within a process, we should enable our customers and users to not have to re-enter that same data manually over again. The example given here, shipping address is the same as billing address. When the checkbox is checked, typically auto-fills the shipping address with the details of the billing address previously provided. This selection may also be provided by a drop-down list, or it might be auto-filled automatically where there is a very, very strong chance that the same data is being reused exactly. So it is as simple as that. If you have a form which is asking the user to enter the same data twice or more, make sure that you are providing an option for them to avoid the manual data entry second and subsequent times, and enabling them to either select their previously entered data to auto pre-populate or using the autofill. So that was a nice quick one to kick us off, and here's another one to follow. It's called consistent help, and it's another level A success criterion. And the important thing I'd like to call out about this one is that this applies if you have help channels defined on your website already. This is not about requiring websites to add help channels to their website. This is about managing the ones that you have. So don't conflate the two together. So if you do have help channels advertised on your site or within your app, where customers and users can either contact your business or look up information so that they can help themselves along a path, it's important to display the access to those help channels in a consistent way and broadly present them throughout your site in the same place, using the same labeling, so that regardless of where people are and what they're doing within your site, if they get stuck, they can recall, oh yes, the help channels are always available in the global header, I'll go there. Or, oh yes, I know that the live chat is always available in the global footer, I'll go there. So it's about consistency in terms of location. Once you put it somewhere, keep it in that roughly the same place. And it's about making sure that things are, labeled consistently as well. There are lots of help channels. Help channels take lots of different forms. I have some of them listed here, something like phone number or store hours or contact hours. It might be a contact form that people submit or an email address that people can mail to. A chatbot, by which I mean an AI chatbot with a whole bunch of canned answers to anticipated questions, as distinct from human messaging. That's another help channel. Frequently asked questions often help people help themselves without your interaction. Then support and help pages are an extension of that. They usually get pretty deep into documentation. And there's also social media channels, which a lot of businesses use as customer contact points as well. So be consistent, be kind, and you'll go a long way towards helping your users make that sale, submit that form, and generally get the job done. The next criteria I have for you today is called Focus Not Obscured. There are several new criteria around focus. This one is by far what I consider to be the easiest. So here it is up front, and we're going to talk about it now. There are two flavors of Focus Not Obscured, both at AA and AAA levels, and I'll distinguish those for you. And Focus Not Obscured is about making sure that when a user is using a keyboard or a similar linear input device interface, that they can always make out where they are via the focus indicator. But particularly and specifically for this criterion, it's all about making sure that we're not building things that prevent the focus indicator from being seen. This happens occasionally when we have floating content, we have layers of content. I have an example on the screen now above me. There is a chatbot window to this particular organization, and it is floating on top of the rest of the page content. It's not a modal situation. The chatbot window doesn't have exclusive access. The parent page is still available for the user to interact with. And if we zoom in a little closer on the chatbot window, behind the chatbot window is a series of links which are listed in the footer. And the first of the links, which is poking out from underneath the chatbot, has a focus ring around it. I presume it's called About Us, and it'll give us some company information. So presumably that is where the person's keyboard focus is currently located. Now, it's not a great situation because while the keyboard focus is sitting there. It is kind of hidden behind this big old chatbot window. So here's the differentiator. Partially hiding a keyboard focus indicator behind floating content is permissible at level AA, but it is not allowed at AAA at all. So the AAA requirement is that when we're tabbing about with a keyboard on the screen and we have floating content like this chatbot window, the chatbot window is not allowed to obscure or hide any portion of that focus indicator. Because I can only see about half of the link text poking out from behind, it means that the focus indicator is also partially hidden, and it means that it checks off it's okay at AA, but not AAA. Side note, I'm not really sure about the constraints around this pair of criteria, in that the layout of a page can vary wildly depending on what the size of your device, the size of your resolution, your zoom settings, your text size settings, and all sorts of things. Those links aren't necessarily always hidden behind the chatbot window. So the testing of this may be a little bit difficult, because you might find some really obscure combination of settings that hides a link, but for the most part it doesn't. When is it okay, when is it not? The only thing I can think of is that it's a roundabout way of saying never ever float content or layer content on top of another. No floating content, no sticky content, which personally wouldn't be a terrible outcome, but watch this space, because I think this one could be a little bit contentious despite being relatively simple. Make sure people know where they're focused at all times. Onwards to dragging movements, and this one I can only describe as plugging a hole, basically, because when you read the text of dragging movements, it might be a question on your mind that it feels very familiar, and you read the wording and you're like, isn't this covered in 2.5.1 pointer gestures, which was introduced in WCAG 2.1 in 2018? It's a very similar criteria. It relates to providing a simple pointer gesture, a single digit tap or a double tap or a long press for different types of movements. Pointer gestures doesn't count for a dragging motion, such as drag and drop, because dragging is not path-based, whereas pointer gestures scopes itself only to path-based movements. And by path-based movements, I mean that when moving from point A to point B, the path in between takes a specific route. There's a specific direction that needs to be covered. So swiping right to execute a particular function is an example of something that is covered under pointer gestures. Drag and drop is not covered by this, because whilst there is a point A and a point B, the path that you take in between those 2 points is entirely up to you. You can do a loop-the-loop, you can do laps around the screen, it really doesn't matter. As long as you pick up from point A and you terminate at point B, the path is irrelevant. So, hence, dragging movements has come into the play to basically fix that gap in pointer gestures. Another question that might occur to you when you're reading the text of dragging movements is, surely meeting 2.1.1 keyboard and existing level A criteria is good enough. If it's keyboard conformant, then surely we're done. And the answer to that is no. Not quite. This criterion and pointer gestures is specifically catering to people who use pointer-based interfaces. So we're talking about mice, we're talking about eye gaze, we're talking about head pointers. We're specifically not talking about keyboard and other linear interfaces like that. Just because something works for a keyboard doesn't mean that it is operable or convenient or usable for someone using a pointing-based interface. So we need to make sure that our interfaces work for both of these forms. So now I have an example on the screen. It's a screen capture from Google Maps, the desktop web experience, and I'm specifically showing the keyboard interface mode of Google Maps. Now this is available if you are using your keyboard, and when you're focused on the search Google Maps zone, you shift tab back once or twice, and it will pop you into this keyboard interface mode, and that enables you to pan the map around the screen using your arrow keys, which is not normally available. This is a great example of a keyboard interface which has been adapted to work entirely for use by keyboard, but that same movement and panning of the map is not available to people using pointer gestures and using pointer interfaces with a simple gesture movement. All of the pointer interface assumes that you will be able to drag and swipe the map around in order to recenter it. So this is an experience that would need to be uplifted in order to meet the new criterion for dragging movements. Another example of dragging movements is a Kanban board. You may be familiar with the idea of clicking and holding on one of these cards and then dragging it, either reorganizing it within a column or moving it from one column to another in order to indicate the progress of a task. Most of these interfaces rely very, very heavily on dragging motions. So some of them may need uplift in order to satisfy this new criterion and enable a simple click, point and click interface to meet this new criterion. Some of these interfaces will already have that capability. Some of them have a context menu built into each of the cards, which will display options which are available via a single click. Move to next column, move to previous column, move up, move down. It might take several more commands, but ultimately the functionality is there. Another example of a dragging movement scenario is a flat list. It's very similar to the cards-based board that we just saw, but we're just moving in the 2 dimensions up and down. And yeah, again, mostly made possible by a drag and drop, but we need to build in the functionality so that someone can point and click and achieve the same reordering mechanism. Another common dragging motion component is a slider. So the ability to slide a slider back and forth and adjust the value, that's considered a dragging movement. But if you are able to point at locate your pointer at a specific point on the slider and click in order to set that value, then that would achieve or that would meet the new dragging movement criterion. All right, so onwards from dragging and onto a related topic. It's about target size. Now, target size may be familiar to some of you. It already exists in WCAG 2.1. It's a level AAA criterion at the moment, target size enhanced, which requires targets, interactive elements, tappable areas, to be at least 44 by 44 pixels, with some exceptions. Given that it's a AAA criterion, there's a lot of folks who are not bothering to go to that level. So now we have a minimum level, which is at AA, which a lot more businesses and organizations will have to take notice of. There's a few points to it, so we'll build it up a little by little. And basically the initial statement is that interactive elements, and I'm talking things like buttons, links, form fields, drop-down boxes, things that you interact with, need to have a touch target area, a clickable area, or a tappable area, whatever you like to call it, of at least 24 by 24 pixels. It needs to be at least 24 pixels wide and 24 pixels tall. If you actually see this rendered on a screen, on your screen, in real size, it's 24 by 24 is really quite tiny. Obviously, I've made mine a lot bigger so you can actually make out the detail. But yeah, if you try and render up a 24 by 24 button on your screen, she's a pretty tiny one. So for the most part, this criterion won't even apply, because hopefully the vast majority of your controls and components are going to be much, much larger than this by default. Job's done. But always, there's always exceptions, and there's always, special cases. So we need to make sure that where they come in, those are covered. So 24 by 24 is the base level expectation. But this criterion actually allows for smaller touch targets than that. So if you need a smaller button, and on my screen now I have a 12 by 12 button, half the height and width of my previous example, what you need to do is to define an inactive space, or a dead zone, or however you like to describe it, around that terribly small button. And that means that no other interactive elements can be in that zone. And what that achieves is that we're trying to avoid people from tapping the wrong button because they're jumbled in too close together. So what you're seeing on the screen here is an example of target offset. Now, target offset is a measurement from one edge of your element, from your button, through the button body, out the other side, and into the adjoining space. Now, what the criterion requires is that target offset needs to be at least 24 pixels long across all dimensions around the entire outside of your element. So here we have a target offset of 24 pixels. It's an exclusive zone just for this button, which is made up of a 12 pixel wide button plus 12 pixels of inactive space to either side and above and below. And that means that if this 12 pixel button was part of a toolbar for, say, a text editor, that means that all of the buttons that are 12 pixels wide would need to be spaced out at least 12 pixels apart in order to meet this criterion. The inactive space, the offset, is allowed to overlap from one item to the other. So you can, the cut button offset occupies the same space as the save button offset. It's about reserving enough space around each item. You don't have to duplicate the space between those items. Again, I hope that this isn't going to happen terribly often, but this is about drawing the line at a very, very small minimum. Now, if you're going even smaller than this, you will find that your target offsite and your exclusive zone, your dead space around your element, grows. And that's the nature of calculating a target offset. So we have the example here on the screen now. At the default bottom end, we have a 24 by 24 pixel button. And that just meets the criterion straight off the bat. There's no requirement for any sort of inactive zone. And you could jam a button right up next to it or above it or below it. And according to the criterion, it'll be hunky-dory. Usability-wise, you might want to test it, but you've got the tick from an audit. If we go back to the half size button, the 12 pixel button, we've got 12 pixels of offset plus 12 pixels of button in order to achieve our 24 pixel total target offset. And in the final example, which I've introduced, there's a teeny tiny 6 pixel button, 6 by 6. Goodness me, it'll be barely visible. But in order to make up the 24 pixel target offset, starting from one edge, passing through the component, out the other side, and making up 24 pixels in inactive space, we need to apply 18 pixels of inactive space in order to make that 24 pixel target offset. So hopefully you can appreciate that the exclusive zone or the inactive zone grows as the target shrinks. And that's just due to the nature of smaller things are harder to hit, so we need to give them more space. Of course, targets are a very complicated topic, and there are exemptions to this setup. Inline elements, it doesn't make sense to define a set height because that would interfere with the layout of paragraphs. Browser-defined elements, as website creators, we have no control over those, so we can't insist on targets for those. If there's another conformant element on the same page that performs the same task and it is big enough, it is a big target, then it's okay to have a small one as well, though why you would, I have no idea. And it's okay to have a ridiculously small target or a bunch of targets close together if it makes sense and it is essential to the presentation of the function. An example of that is map pins. So map pins have to correspond to a particular location on a map, and that location may cause multiple pins to be very close to or to overlap with each other, meaning that they would technically fail this target size criterion. But map pins that don't correspond to their location on a map is worse. So they're allowed to have an exemption. All right, we're getting into some bigger and chunkier criteria now, so strap in. It's really starting to get good. It's time to talk about accessible authentication. It's all about logging in, signing in, authenticating, telling a website who you are, so that you may be identified, so that you can access privileged information, whatever needs to happen. There are two new criteria for accessible authentication. They occur at level AA and AAA. They basically overlap very heavily, so I'll go through and identify where they differ. But basically, accessible authentication is all about trying to bring more control back to the user, and in doing so, trying to satisfy this statement: make it possible to authenticate without remembering, transcribing, or manipulating any information. Now that is a huge statement, and it's got a lot of implications. Remembering information. Typically during authentication, we have to remember our username, and more, as importantly, remembering your password. So how do we authenticate without remembering something? Transcribing is another common authentication tool. Transcribing might be that you receive a two-factor code and you have to type it in to the site. You may have to take a value that you've written down somewhere else and write it down into the site. So transcribing can be problematic for people who have reading or literacy conditions. It might be problematic if you have trouble recognizing individual characters, or if you have, you often swap common characters or, very similar characters. So yeah, transcribing is problematic. Manipulating information, things like performing calculations, being able to spell correctly. Again, they're good, useful tools for proving potentially that you are a human as opposed to a bot. But hopefully we can do away with them in terms of needing to authenticate, like the actual task of authentication itself. So if we can't authenticate by memory, and we can't authenticate by transcribing, and we can't authenticate by proving our manipulation of data, how can we authenticate instead? So the first thing we can do is look at alternative ways to authenticate. And one that's coming up and is increasingly popular is biometrics. Most mobile phones these days, most smartphones, have some sort of biometric authentication or multiple forms built in. So there's Face ID, there's fingerprint ID, voice identification. So biometrics are a good way to identify yourself. I'm not sure what the implications are for people who are identical or twins or multiple births, but for most of the population, biometrics should be a pretty useful authentication tool. Interestingly, while I said that remembering a password or remembering a unique username is an unreasonable test of memory, it has been considered that things like your own name, your email address, and your phone number, it's okay to consider people remember and provide those values. That's because your name, your email address, and your phone number are data points related to you that exist well and beyond a particular website. Your email address follows you around everywhere. So does your phone number, and certainly so does your name. So it is not considered a test of memory to remember one's email address. And so it becomes very, very useful to use one's email address as a username, as opposed to defining a specific username for your site. USB tokens are a good alternative authentication source. These are little gadgets which you can just stick into a slot on your computer and press a button, and it will deliver a token which authenticates you. The fact that you own and have that token in your possession is the authentication. Only one token exists. It's been coded specifically to your identifier. So yeah, provided you keep that USB token safe, it's a good way to say, I am me, it's okay. Authentication links work well. You might receive an authentication link via email or via a notification on your phone or via a text message, and they can contain a link which has a authentication token embedded in it. And again, it's the idea that because you have access to that email address account, the fact that you have access to the device which has the app which you've previously authenticated on, the fact that you have access to the phone which receives the text message sent to the number that is registered for that account, that's the act of authentication right there. Third-party login via OAuth. These are pop-ups that you may have seen around the place and you didn't even appreciate that it was called OAuth. Basically, if you've seen a button that says login with Facebook, login with Twitter, login with Google, you have seen a demonstration of an OAuth login. And basically the idea is, again, it's that secondary, if you're authenticated over here, then we know enough about who you are to prove that you have access to login over there. So yeah, OAuth. And similarly, web authentication, which is device-based authentication. And again, it's that that idea of ownership. You've logged in on this device previously. We've got a record of that. Hence, you must be that person. And yeah. I'm not saying that we have to do away with username and password authentication entirely. That's important, right? Because up until this point, I've just gone, let's do all the other things. Sometimes I appreciate that's not possible, or it involves a terribly large amount of work. So it is possible to retain the traditional username and password login, but it's important to provide mechanisms to support your users as they're logging in to make that process as painless as possible and to still avoid the remembering, transcribing, and manipulating of information that I talked about before. We still need to avoid those key tasks. So if your username and password fields support the ability to copy-paste, you're in the clear, because it immediately becomes possible for a user to copy their username from their text file or wherever they're keeping their credentials, paste it into your website. They haven't had to type anything. They're less likely to make errors, and they're on their way. Similarly, password manager integration shouldn't be blocked. If you have password manager integration enabled on your site, that means that the password manager will automatically, it will store all of the user's passwords and user details. And when it detects a site that it has credentials for, it will auto-populate those credentials straight in, no data entry required. And similar to that, if a person hasn't shelled out for a password manager, most browsers have the ability to save passwords into the user's browser profile. And if the password field has been identified correctly as a password field in code, the browser will do its best job to remember and autofill that password detail for the user in future visits. So, not all is lost. I'm not saying drop passwords and usernames entirely. Here's some options where it makes it okay. Now, I did say that accessible authentication has a AA and a AAA component, and this is where they differ. So up until this point, any of the techniques that I've talked about would satisfy both AA and AAA accessible authentication. Now, there's a couple of additional aspects which you can apply to meet AA, but would not meet the AAA criterion. So there's two items here. At AA, you can perform an authentication task which is based on recognizing generic objects. This smells and sounds and quacks like a CAPTCHA. But of course, that comes with all of the caveats and warnings that everyone's already heard about using CAPTCHA. These can be problematic, both from a technical perspective, making sure that it's all coded correctly, but also from a cultural perspective. What is a generic object to you may not be obvious to someone else. It might be a geographical difference, an age range difference. What you readily recognize as a generic object may be totally, literally foreign to someone else. So it's acceptable, but I wouldn't recommend it. The other option that you can do for authentication at AA level, but not AAA, is provide a test where you ask the user to identify an image, an audio, or a video that they themselves have provided in the past. So you could pop up 5 profile pictures and ask them to pick their own, for example. Notice specifically that in this content provided by the user clause that it does not mention text. So that means that things like security questions, what was your favorite movie as a child, or what street did you grow up on, or what was your mother's maiden name, those sorts of things are not covered. They are a memory test and would still need some level of support or alternative that I've already covered. So interesting. Now we're on the home straight, and the home straight starts with a reclassification. 247 Focus Visible, joined WCAG in 2.0 back in 2008. The wording has not changed. All they're doing is reclassifying it from a AA down to a level A. And I'm not going to rehash what focus visible means. It's basically what it says on the box, which is visible keyboard focus. There's no requirements explicitly stated about how big the keyboard focus indicator needs to be or what color the keyboard focus indicator needs to be. You can potentially tie in some of the contrast requirements from 1.4.11, non-text contrast, but it's all a little bit muddy because there's a few different colors going on. There's the color of the focus style, there's the color of the element, there's also the color of the background, who's doing what. So that is where focus appearance comes in. It's a new criteria. It's the last one I'm going to cover today. It's AA criterion, so it's going to apply to pretty much everyone who's listening. And it attempts to define a minimum standard for how big and how beautiful color-wise a focus indicator needs to be in order to be somewhat useful and noticeable. So there's a lot of words in this criterion. I've got to warn you, there's a lot of caveats, exceptions, and all the rest of it. I'll try and unpick the big points out of it, but please, do take your time with this one and check your working. I will also say, because I'm discussing the candidate recommendation, this criterion is actually marked as at risk. So it may or may not make the final cut. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and hopefully I don't waste too much time on it. So I have a submit button. It's a white button with black text. It is being presented on a black background, so there is a lot of contrast for this button and its text in its default state. Now, the default focus appearance is defined as a solid outline. So a solid outline, an unbroken box or shape around your element. It doesn't have to hug the shape. Mine currently does, but I'm going to make a point about that. But basically, it's a solid outline around your shape. And So that's what it needs to be. Solid outline. As soon as you've done a solid outline, you don't have to worry about counting pixels or calculating area or anything like that. It's a solid outline. It's enough. And there's no minimum width. So you can start at a 1 pixel wide outline if you wish. I would recommend that you go a little higher than that, but for the bare minimum, 1 pixel solid outline is sufficient to meet this criteria. Then you have to worry about colors. So we have to compare the focus color, which in this case is my red solid outline, with the unfocused color of the same pixels. So where the red pixels are currently sitting, before the red pixels were there, those pixels were black because that was just a black background surrounding the button. So I need to check the contrast ratio between the focused pixel colors that are red and the unfocused pixel colors, which were black, and make sure that there's a difference of at least 3 to 1. So it's a ratio of at least 3 to 1. We're making sure that this thing pops. In addition to that, I also need to make sure that the outline is clearly visible against its adjacent colors. And by adjacent colors, I mean the colors on either side of my solid outline. So for my red outline, I need to make sure that adjacent outside, red and black, exceed a ratio of 3 to 1. And adjacent inside, red and white, the button color, also exceeds 3 to 1. And that's again about making sure that this outline has popped enough to make sure that people can see it clearly. So if we zoom in real tight on my button here, and the white button is represented by the white corner of the slide above me now. And then we show the focus style sitting against my button. Just to reiterate, the focus color is the red. The outside color is the black, the outside area. That is my first adjacent color check. And I need to make sure that the red versus the black meets 3 to 1, which it does. My second contrast check is to make sure, again, against the focus color, which is red, I check that the inside adjacent color, which is white, also exceeds a ratio of 3 to 1, which it does. And finally, I need to make sure that the focus color red has sufficient contrast against the color of the pixels that it replaced. So the focused versus the unfocused state. So the focused state is red, the unfocused state is black, which also happens to be the adjacent outside color as well. It has to exceed 3 to 1, which it does. The adjacent calculation will change depending on whether your outline is hugging your element or if it's been given some breathing space. So I have an example on the page now where a submit button has a focus style defined. It's a yellow outline this time. And the yellow outline doesn't do well against a white button when they're hugging up against each other because yellow and white do not contrast very well together. My adjacent inside check fails color contrast. Adjacent outside is fine, yellow and black. My focus versus unfocused color check is fine, yellow and black. But my adjacent inside color check, yellow and white, doesn't meet 3 to 1, so it's a fail. However, the button below that, the outline has been pushed away from the button. It's been given a bit of breathing space, and you can see a ring of black in between the button and the focus outline. And that means that the adjacent calculation, adjacent inside, is no longer comparing yellow to the background of the button white, but the adjacent background of the page, which is black, and now it passes. And hopefully you'll agree that the bottom focus ring is a lot clearer. Now, that is a very simple focus style, a box. And I'd like to think that there are some creative people in the room who are just like, yeah, I want to do a little bit more with my focus styles. What are my options? So things that you might want to do with your focus style is you might want to do a color flip when an element receives focus. You might want to do a color change when your element receives focus. You might want to do some weird glowy thing. You might want to change the size of your button without changing the color. Or you might want to do something dashy or spotty or anything like that. All of these buttons pass the new focus appearance criterion due to the exceptions that I'm about to outline for you. So basically, the focus style has to have a minimum size, a minimum area, and we have to do a couple of color checks as well. So keep these in mind as we describe this next bit. So there's two ways to calculate the minimum size. One's by area and one's shortest side. We still have to do the same focused versus unfocused contrast check that we did for the solid outline. So we still need to check that the pixels that are flipping for this focus style are flipping to a decent amount. And the adjacent contrast check is still present, but it's not mandatory anymore. The adjacent contrast check, if you pass it, you're fine and your focus style is done. But if you choose to, you can use a low contrast color, but make sure it is of sufficient width so that the overall size of the element looks like it's changed. So here we go. Here's the area calculation. Focus area needs to be a number of pixels which is greater than 1 pixel solid border of the element. So for my submit button, my example here with a width of 200 pixels and a height of 50. 200 width, 200 top, 200 bottom, 50 left, 50 right. -4, because we always count the corners twice, and there's 4 corners, means that we need a focus style for this particular button which takes up at least 496 pixels. How you arrange those pixels is entirely up to you. You can do a box. We've already talked about the box. But you can move on from that. You can do dashes, provided that, you know, the number of pixels in those dashes adds up to more than 496 pixels in total. You know, you can do your glow effect, provided the number of pixels in your glow effect exceeds 496 pixels around this button. Yeah, options are endless. As long as you use up at least 496 pixels, 496 pixels must change somehow in your focus style. So that could be a color flip, it could be introducing a new shape, whatever. So that's the area calculation. Okay, so hold that. I am going to ask you to remember. And here's the thing that I found a little bit troubling about the documentation as it's currently written for the candidate recommendation. It's a little bit vague when it comes to how do I calculate the area of irregular shapes, because not every element is a nice, convenient rectangle or a square. Sometimes we have hearts for favoriting. Sometimes we have stars. Sometimes we have thumbs up. There's all sorts of different shapes around. And for those focus styles, the documentation basically throws its hands in the air and goes, just eyeball it and give it your best guess. Which is fantastic. Look, it's an acknowledgement we don't all have degrees in mathematics, right? So I can't really go much beyond that. Like, if you're trying to calculate the minimum area of a focus style that's shown around a thumbs up emoji button, yeah, good luck. Maybe pop it in a circle and calculate around a circle. At least circles have, proper formulas that you can use. But yeah, if you are going to stick to like a glow effect around a star, yeah, just do your best. The final calculation that we have as an option for our focus appearance is a 4-pixel wide block along the shortest side of your element. And for those who are wondering what that looks like, it's about this big. I've done this to scale on my quote-unquote 200 pixel wide button. This is what 4 pixels would look like at that scale. It's really quite small, isn't it? So yeah, I'm not a fan of this one. I think it's too subtle. But yeah, if you've got a 4-pixel wide block along the shortest side of your element, regardless of, the dimensions, and you've met the contrast checks, then you're good to go. Now, I could talk about that focus appearance thing in depth for a whole lot longer, but I've got to wrap it up. So here is the list of what we covered today. Accessible authentication, consistent help, dragging movements, focus appearance, focus not observed, focus visible being recategorized, redundant entry, and target size. There's a lot to take in for WCAG 2.2. I'm super interested to see what makes the final cut. I hope this has been interesting for you. I really enjoyed bringing it to you today. So I look forward to talking to you and hearing from you about this in the chat or on Twitter. Catch you later.
AliCamp 2022.